Kashamitra asked me if I'd be willing to come and do this talk, and I was quite keen to do it. A Wesak talk. And Wesak is the occasion of the Buddha's enlightenment. I'm sure you've picked that up in the course of the day. So in a way, it's the single most significant event in the whole Buddhist calendar, just marking the enlightenment. And I will eventually get to Bodh Gaya and the Buddha, but if you don't mind, I want to start in suburban Birmingham in the early 2000s. And when Akashamitra asked me to do this, I hesitated for a minute or two and just thought, is there anything that I think it would be interesting to talk about, or that people would be interested to hear? And a conversation came to mind that happened in this little room in what was called Majjhimaloka, one of the Buddhist communities in Moseley in Birmingham, one of the posher bits of Birmingham, it has to be said, nice leafy suburb. And one of the fringe benefits of being kind of involved in the institutions of Triratna is you get to eavesdrop on a lot of conversations. I was involved in setting up a lot of conversations. In this particular conversation, I was eavesdropping on. And it was a small group of some of the most experienced meditation teachers in Triratna, meeting with Sangharakshita, who's the founder of Triratna. And they wanted to talk about a particular topic. They were talking about Buddha nature and talking about a set of ideas that comes from a text called the Tathagata Garbha Sutra and later. Tathagata Garbha means like womb. Tathagata is one of the names of the Buddha. So Tathagata Garbha means the context, the conditions out of which Buddhas are born. So they wanted to talk about the set of teachings that came out of this sutra. And one of the beautiful things about the Tathagata Garbha Sutra, it's a set of images about how basically enlightenment is almost innate in the mind. And the point they were making is this is such an encouraging way of thinking about ourselves and thinking about our own minds. I remember once somebody saying that most of us live in the narrow space between who we think we're supposed to be and who we're afraid we might be. And to have an idea of what you're looking at when you dig deeper is basically the potential for enlightenment. It's quite a change in how we assume our experience is going to be. So anyway, there was this conversation, this little group of meditation teachers saying, this is so encouraging, we should be making more of this in our teaching. So Sangharakshita, who's also in the room, was saying that he really loved the beauty of the images of the metaphors. I'm going to say a bit more about the metaphors from the Tathagata Garbha Sutra in a minute. But so he was saying how beautiful the metaphors were. But he said that he thought philosophically, if people take the images too literally, it becomes a bit philosophically problematic. And he was saying that the Tathagata Garbha Sutra teachings, the Buddha nature teachings, the idea that in the depth of our mind is the womb of the Buddha, comes from the later tradition, maybe, I don't know, 500, 700 years after the time of the Buddha. And Sangharakshita was saying that in the early tradition, he thought there were other ideas that did the same job of pointing out this potential within our own mind. And in particular, he said, he thought a teaching called the positive nidanas, which is a description of this unfolding process of experience. He thought that did in the early tradition the job that Buddha nature did in the later tradition. So as I say, one of the benefits of the responsibility that I had was I got to eavesdrop on these conversations. One of the downsides was I didn't understand half the conversations I was listening to. And it really floored me. I'm thinking, so Paticca Samutpada, the positive nidanas, if you know anything about Buddhist sort of philosophy or Buddhist psychology, that these that's one of the core descriptions of the kind of unfolding nature of experience. And quite psychological, quite philosophical, quite precise. And the Buddha nature teachings are all images, they're all sort of very evocative, but fuzzy. And I'm thinking, how could the positive nidanas do the same job as the Buddha nature teaching? And to be honest, I think that was genuinely a question for me for, I'm not so great on numbers, but let's say a decade, 15 years, thinking, what did that mean? And in thinking about the talk today, that was the first thing that came to mind. And trying to kind of explain it to myself, well, actually explaining it to a friend of mine this morning, I was thinking, in that room, in that meeting, what people were what people were discussing is how best to communicate the content of the Buddha's experience under the Bodhi tree on the full moon in Wesak about 2,450 years ago. How do you communicate that? And even more than that, how do you do it in a way that people can understand and in a way that makes that experience accessible for them? So realizing that that was what that conversation was about. How do we talk about the Enlightenment? And it's a discussion that the Buddha had with Brahma Sahampati, the Buddha under the Bodhi tree. On this full moon, has this experience of awakening. And he's describing the experience, well, to himself, you know, like in some of the sutras later, he tells people what was going through his mind. And one of the things that was going through his mind was, this has never been seen before. This has never been understood before. How do I communicate this? How do I tell people about this? How do I find a language that makes it accessible? You know, the Buddha's build up to this, he's been practicing for years. There's the famous stories about him immediately before the Enlightenment, where he's fasting, where he says he's so thin that if he touched his belly button, he could feel his spine. You know, so he's involved in these austerities. Sits under the tree finally, resolves after years of practice, years of feeling he was getting nowhere, this little line, flesh may wither away, blood may dry up, but I'm not getting up until I've reached awakening. So you get this image of, on that full moon night, the experience of enlightenment. And you get it in images, and you get it in concepts. So the Buddha talking about it uses images. When he's talking about communicating it, he says he looks over all living beings, and he's looking at what he describes as a sea of lotuses in different stages of unfoldment, and responds to the image. And he also describes it using ideas, using concepts. So I just want to say a couple of things about each of those. One of the images is the Buddha. In Buddhist iconography, it takes a few hundred years, I think, before the Buddha's actually shown in images. I was in an exhibition a couple of years ago called The Tree and the Serpent. And most of the early images of the Buddha don't have the Buddha in it. They have the image of the tree and this sense of roots going down into the earth, of branches opening up to the sky. You know, like the enlightenment happened under this tree, but the Buddha as a figure is absent from it. And sometimes it's a wheel, and sometimes it's footprints. There's no Buddha in the images. The later tradition got a bit braver or a bit more willing to take risks. And there's a fantastic image that's the classic image of the Enlightenment. And it's the Buddha sitting in meditation like this. His right hand is touching the earth. So again, this sense is something, even though it's the Enlightenment, it's something grounded, it's something rooted. And around the Buddha, a halo, but around the halo, not this pretty image of lotuses emerging from the water. It's a horde of demons. And again, some of you will know this image. It's Mara's horde. Mara is the Buddhist devil, if you like. And Mara's hordes are all the forces of samsara, all the forces of conditioned existence, trying to stop this moment of enlightenment. And one of the things about these demons in the Buddhist tradition is they're all a little bit comic. So that the Buddhist tradition tends not to be very afraid of demons. There's a beautiful image in Borobudur of Yama, who's death. And to go from the lower floors in this big temple called Borobudur to the higher floors, you've got to literally walk through the jaws of death, right? The top lintel is the top of the jaw. The ground is the bottom jaw. There's two big eyes, there's fangs, and you've got to walk through it. But it was like a early 7th century Javanese Disney character, you know, like it's just ever so slightly comical. And you're walking through this comical idea of death into this open space that's above it. And it's a bit the same with Mara's hordes. You get all these demons, they're grotesque, they've got fangs, they've got more eyes than anybody can need. They've got eyes in their belly, they've got teeth in their belly. They're throwing boulders, they're throwing arrows, they're throwing spears, they're throwing tree trunks, they're throwing insults. One of the texts says they're crying, "Kill him, bind him, drive him away." Some had heads of lions, serpents, tigers, other bore skulls, garlands of entrails. Some hurled boulders, axes, flaming arrows. Others conjured earthquakes to overwhelm the Buddha. So the Buddha's just sitting there in meditation, and around the Buddha, this aura. And all of the weapons, as they hit the aura, turn into flowers, and the flowers fall at the Buddha's feet. So I'll let you sit with the image for a minute. My friend over in the corner, sitting by the door, Attila, is a great one for the meaning of images. My tendency is always to want to translate them into concepts. But one of the things I learned is just stay with the image for a minute. So that illness, that image of stillness, and all around the stillness, this turmoil, this assault on the awareness, and everything transformed to flowers. So that as an image of the Enlightenment. The more conceptual side of it, the Buddha talking about enlightenment afterwards, he said, as dawn approached, actually this is from a later text called the Lalita Vistara, a Mahayana text. It said, as the dawn approached, the Buddha perceived the true nature of all phenomena. The nidanas, the links of dependent origination, that there was no permanent separate self, and he saw the cessation of suffering. So that's the philosophical content, which again I'm going to try and say something about. And then another little image that says, instantly 10,000 worlds trembled, and a light more radiant than 1,000 suns pierced the darkness of ignorance. And the reason I'm quoting this is just to say, from the point of view of the Buddhist tradition, Wesak, the Enlightenment, is the significant moment. this idea of the 10,000 worlds trembling, that there are earthquakes, gives you a sense of how weighty this moment is for the Buddhist tradition. So it's a big deal. And then a question that Sangharakshita said he always brought when looking at the Buddhist tradition is, why did the Buddha teach this? Why does this matter? So one of the things I want to go into now is just to try to get a sense of how does that impact on our experience? What's the significance for us? And if you don't mind, I'm going to chunk it down to something. I'm going to talk about myself. So January this year, I was on solitary retreat, and more or less at the same time, around Bodh Gaya, around the Bodhi tree, around the spot where traditionally the Buddha was enlightened, was the order convention. There was maybe 400 or 500 order members just doing shared practice in that place where the Buddha got enlightened. And again, I don't know if this matters to anybody else, but it probably was the place that the Buddha got enlightened. That there's a lot of archaeological evidence, there's a lot of contemporary descriptions, both from within the Buddhist tradition and from comparative texts that point to Bodh Gaya as where the enlightenment happened. And it's quite a thing just sitting on the spot, or at least in the area where the Buddha was enlightened, and practicing with another 300, 400, 500 people who are also sharing your practice. Actually, that's the order members who were there. And there are Thai Buddhists, Tibetan Buddhists, Vietnamese Buddhists, Chinese Buddhists, just this sort of melting pot of Buddhists practicing together on that spot where the Buddha was enlightened. I was only there in imagination. I was 1,100 miles further south and on a retreat on my own. But I was looking in particular at the mindfulness of breathing practice, like spending a month just reading around, studying around, practicing that particular practice. And at least I can comfort myself a bit. The mindfulness of breathing practice traditionally is the practice that the Buddha was doing immediately before his enlightenment. So if any of you ever worry that the mindfulness of breathing is too introductory a practice, the Buddha was doing it immediately before enlightenment, so stick in. Sitting there and meditating, doing the mindfulness of breathing practice, and just having this experience, I want to make this argument in the course of this talk, that if you do this practice, this is likely to be what happens. So I'm breathing in, I'm breathing out, I'm paying attention to it, and my mind, to begin with, is all over the place. I've just got my usual preoccupations, my usual distractions, all the stuff that usually happens, the stuff that I would rather be doing, the people that annoy me, whatever my mind turns to. Then just gradually, this sense of all the distractions settle down, at least for a bit, at least for a minute or two. And the mind gets a little bit clearer, and you're a little more connected to yourself, and your body relaxes a little bit. And just having this sense of, out of the chaos of my habitual mental states, the clouds clearing a bit, and blue sky and sunshine, just the clarity emerges after you take awareness into your experience. This is significant. I've got more to say about this later, but I hope some people recognize, just that it's a modest first step. It's not a big deal. Just you pay attention to your breath, pay attention to your body, and your mind, to some extent, starts to settle. The awareness starts to clear. And I just had this experience of gratitude. I was thinking that I'm sitting here, I'm doing a practice that the Buddha did before his enlightenment. I'm doing a practice that the Buddhist tradition has kept alive for a couple of thousand years. And I'm being taught ways of paying attention to my own experience that move me out of my own habitual chaos into a clearer, deeper, more connected experience of myself. And it was just, like, I think one of the beautiful things about the Buddhist tradition is it can accommodate anybody. The tradition talks about there being 64,000 Dharma doors. And nobody needs 64,000 Dharma doors, but people are different, right? And I've got, I'm growing up in post-war Calvinist Scotland. I've got a particular turn of mind. I'm a bit skeptical. I'm not very devotional. And the Buddhist tradition says, okay, we can work with that. Gives me a framework of how to pay attention to my experience. I can verify directly whether or not it works. So I've got a set of tools that allow me to go more deeply into my own experience. And just thinking, what a fantastic thing. Like almost a little kind of moment of panic of what would my life be like if I hadn't learned the skills that, if I act out of awareness and kindness, it tends to feel better than if I act out of craving and aversion. And then not just the idea, but these are the precepts that would support that. These are the meditation practices, mindfulness of breathing, metta bhavana, that give you a different relationship to your experience, a different relationship to the world. And there was this little moment where I felt the whole tradition was the Buddha trying to explain his experience to me. So I'm looking at this text, I'm looking at the Buddha talking about the mindfulness of breathing. And when you first come across it, it's these 16 quite terse, quite precise verses. And it can sound like quite a complex teaching. But I think a lot of the Buddhist tradition, think that teaching is basically it's the Buddha sitting down saying, look, this is what awareness is like. I want to try and describe it to you in a way that gives you a feel for it. And I want to try and describe it to you in a way that gives you a taste of it that you can access. And there was just that shift, a moment of feeling that I was going from a kind of formulaic teaching almost into a moment of communication. Just this sense of it's the awake, aware mind of the Buddha trying to describe what awakeness is like, what awareness is like, what kindness is like. And just that little moment of feeling it impact my own experience. And I think there's something in the whole Buddhist tradition that's at the core of it. Like I was thinking, if you come across Buddhism, Sangharakshita talks about that the Buddhist tradition is so keen to make the Dharma accessible that it just keeps on finding new ways of explaining it. So I came up with the 3 lakshanas. I better find my list actually, bear with me for a moment. 3 lakshanas, 4 noble truths, 5 spiritual faculties, 6 paramitas, 7 factors of enlightenment, 8-fold path, 9 recollections or mindfulness practices, 10 fetters, 11 positive mental events, 12 nidanas, and I could keep on going. There's a list called the 51 mental events. So they got to 51 and they were still counting, right? But all of that is just trying to say, look, this is what it's like, that this is a helpful way of looking at your experience. And actually at the core of it is something much simpler. It's an attempt for somebody more aware than we are. I tend to talk about practice in terms of awareness. Could equally talk about it in terms of kindness. You could talk about it in terms of the effort the Buddha went to make the Dharma available. A mind that's more aware, more awake, kinder than ours, trying to describe to us what that experience is like. The whole tradition is that. And the tradition just kept on doing it, kept on finding other ways of saying, well, if that doesn't make sense, you could look at it like this. So all of the teachings at their core, in a sense, you don't need to know any of them unless you find them helpful. And a lot of them are helpful. And how you know they're helpful is you feel the impact of it on your experience. Pay attention to the breath, your mind gets a little more still. Pay attention to your body relaxes and releases a little bit. Come into relationship with somebody else with the intention to just be aware of them and just think, how can I respond to this person in a way that might be helpful, in a way that creates connection? And those intentions change the quality of our experience. There's something really simple at the core of even quite complex philosophical teachings. So just that little moment of sense of communication and the sense of the whole tradition. A friend of mine once described the Buddhist tradition as a 2,500 year collaborative project to liberate beings from suffering. So that the whole 2,500 year history is just, how do we communicate this in a way that people find helpful? So by way of my solitary retreat, I want to come back to the Tathagatagarbha Sutra. So the whole tradition is trying to find ways to communicate what was that experience under the Bodhi tree like? What was the flavour of it? So there's a set of metaphors in the Tathagatagarbha Sutra. And I want to just touch, if I may, to begin with, on the metaphors. So there are two main languages that the Buddhist tradition used to try and communicate that experience. You could maybe say that there are more, but let's say two primary ones. And one is a symbolic language. It's the language of images. And one is a more conceptual language. It's the language of ideas, of philosophical precision. And they support each other. Some of the high-end teachings, like the experience of enlightenment, for example, talks sometimes about seeing everything as impermanent. And the Japanese tradition, there's a line from a Japanese poem that says, if you don't believe, look at September, look at October. The falling leaves cover the ground and fill the rivers. Right? Same idea, just expressed in two languages. The Tathagatagarbha Sutra in particular is just a set of images about what enlightenment's like. The first image, it says, enlightenment is like honey in a cave or a tree, protected by bees. And then it says, imagine somebody comes along who knows how to get past the bees and get to the honey. And it says, that's what your mind is like. Your mind's like honey in a rock, protected by bees. And the Buddha does what Atla tells me not to do. He translates the image into ideas. And he says, the bees are the kleshas. And kleshas in the Buddhist tradition is what causes us pain. So this idea, these little things that sting. So the kleshas are the things that cause us an experience of pain. And traditionally, there are three main kleshas. There's the klesha of confusion, that we just don't see experience clearly. So we misunderstand it. There's the klesha of craving, which in this whole spread of experience, we lock on to a couple of parts of that spread of experience that we think are going to satisfy us and just stop being aware of the rest of it. And there's the klesha of aversion, which is the things that we feel are likely to be painful, so we resist them or we push away. So we've got a relationship to our experience that's confused, that's narrowing down out of craving, or that's narrowing down out of resistance, out of pushing away. And what the whole tradition is trying to say is that if you move into something where you're paying attention, where you're not fixating on one part of experience, but just gradually starting to open up, if you're not resisting, if you're not pushing away, but you're willing to, in a way, have a relationship of empathy to the whole field of your experience, your whole relationship to yourself, your whole relationship to the world around us starts to qualitatively change. So the first image in the Tathagatagarbha Sutra is honey in the rock, protected by bees. You can get past the bees, and when you're past the bee, the nature of your mind is the honey. Second image is an image of a kernel of wheat that's still in the husk. And it says somebody who doesn't know what they're looking at just sees the husk and think there's something of no value there. But if you unfold the husk, if you plant the kernel, it becomes something nourishing, it becomes something that can grow. So that's the second of the images. Third of the images, I'm just going to take the sutra's word for this, but it's an image of a mango seed. And according to the sutra, you can leave a mango seed or a mango kernel for years. It can be completely dried out, but if you plant it, it grows. And not only does it grows into a big and a beautiful tree. So the third of the images is something that's been neglected, something that's been allowed to dry up. Once it's planted, once the conditions are there, growth happens. One more image. The image in the sutra is of gold that's fallen into a pit of waste and been neglected. So it's saying that the nature of your mind, the nature of our mind, is like gold that's fallen into a pit of waste. All of these images are something of real value, covered up by something comparatively superficial. So that's the Tathagatagarbha Sutra image. There's a later Buddha nature, later Tathagatagarbha Sutra that goes further. And it says that the nature of your own mind, this capacity for awakening in your own mind, it says it's like a golden statue of the Buddha that's been wrapped in rags, dropped by the wayside, and gradually covered in dirt. Just nobody notices it. So the teaching, the Buddhist teaching, is to take attention to this thing of beauty, to pick it up, to dust it off, to unwrap it, to polish it, and to see what a beautiful thing that we're looking at. So that the last of the metaphors from the Tathagatagarbha Sutra is this golden Buddha wrapped in rags, dropped by the wayside, neglected and covered in dirt. And the whole kind of import of the sutra is that the teaching tells you how to get past the rags, how to get past the dirt, how to unhusk it, how to plant the seed, how to, what was the first image? That just each of the images to get past the bees, to get to the honey. It's just this beautiful image that the difficult stuff is on the surface. And the deeper you go, the more beautiful the experience comes. So that's the Tathagatagarbha Sutra images. And all of them just so positive, sweetness, nourishment, beauty, value, all of those of the sort of nature of mind. So we're in this room in Birmingham and we're having this discussion, and the meditation teachers are saying, isn't this great? We should be making more of images like this. And Sangharakshita, who's in the discussion, acknowledges that, says, you're right, beautiful set of images. They're so encouraging, they're so affirming. But with images, you've got to watch, if you're not careful, images are by their nature ambiguous. So sometimes you need something that's more conceptually clear. The concepts don't excite you so much, but they make sure you're not misunderstanding the image. It depends on your temperament. Sometimes the concepts do excite you so much, but for some people, they don't have the emotional power of the image. So that's when he brought in this idea of the positive nidanas. And if you don't mind, if you've got the patience, I want just to say something about the nidanas. So that the nidanas come out of this basic insight under the Bodhi tree. So that the Buddha's looking at experience. And one of the things that he's seeing is that the whole of reality is this unfolding process of becoming an experience of duration, an experience of passing. You're just watching phenomena come into being and passing. But then it goes further than that. It's saying that it doesn't happen at random. You're looking at a process of conditions, that one set of conditions creates what emerges from it. What emerges becomes the next condition from what emerges from that. So that's the nature of reality, at least in one of the formulations from the Buddhist tradition. And it's starting to take everything that we habitually see as fixed. We feel we're fixed, their experience is fixed, the relationship to the world is fixed. And actually what it's starting to do is to get us to plug in to what, like even just the breath, right? You've got this idea of the breath, and it's so neat and so kind of conceptually clear. And then you pay attention to this particular breath, right? And the Anapanasati Sutta says, well, what's it like? Is that a long breath? Is that a short breath? Is that a deep breath? Is that a shallow breath? Did you enjoy it? Did you not enjoy it? Is it the same as the previous breath? Is it different from the previous breath? What's it like? If you pay attention to that. And then it goes on, the same sutta just says, and how do you feel? If you pay attention to how you feel right now, or how your body feels, pleasant, unpleasant, I'm tense, I'm relaxed. All right, what's that like? Just start to pay attention to what it is you're describing as your body tense. Just feel the moment by moment shift of all those sensations. And what's it like when that comes into awareness? You start to be aware of how you feel. You start to be aware of when you talk to somebody, the impact it has on them, or when you listen to somebody, the impact they have on you. And the whole thing starts to get a little less fixed and a little more fluid than it started. So you've got this sense of things are process, and that process has a shape to it, has a pattern to it. So what the nidanas are doing is, well, again, sort of Sangharakshita says that this is the basic shape of the Buddhist path. It says that you've got this pattern of experience emerging, including our minds. Pay attention to your own mind. And what you're looking at is just this flow of experience. I say something that might be a bit interesting, and it shapes your mind. I say something that's a bit boring, and your mind goes somewhere else. But your mind's just this stream of experience responding to being shaped by conditions. And the positive nidanas say there are certain conditions that are so significant that if you're aware of them, you have a significant shape on what emerges from that. And basically, it's back to the kleshas. It's saying that you can respond to experience out of confusion, or you can pay attention. You can push experience away, or you can allow yourself to become interested and connected to it. And that confusion, that pushing away, that awareness and that connection create two completely different streams of experience. I was talking to a friend of mine yesterday and trying to say how helpful this is. And my friend was saying she doesn't find it in the slightest bit helpful. that it's too much information, and that as soon as you start to give that kind of detail, she just thinks it's too much information. That's probably the best thing. That for her, the significant thing was just looking at experience, looking at the flow of it, letting it go. That's what practice is. The nidanas are much more specific than that. I've got, I don't know, maybe it's ADHD. I've got a very distracted mind, and actually having a structure that I can pin my experience to, I find really helpful. Anyway, coming out of the Buddha's enlightenment, the Buddha trying to describe what he saw, one of the ways he chose to describe it was the nidanas. And Sangharakshita was saying that, again, that the Buddhist tradition gives you so many descriptions of what the path is. You can be completely forgiven for not being sure what the path is. And he says, what should be the single most important thing, what it is that you have to do to support that process of awakening. If you're not careful, you miss it under all the detail of the alternatives that the tradition gives you. So one of the things he was trying to do was to strip down all the different presentations of the path to get what he called what the path was in principle. And what he's saying the path is in principle is this unfolding, deepening, connecting, liberating process of mind that arises out of conditions. There's a text called the Chetana Sutta. Sorry to keep on throwing suttas at you, but there's a beautiful set of verses that describes this. I'm going to see if I can find it. It talks about the different stages that the mind goes through when you start to take awareness in. And it says, for a person who's free from remorse, so the whole Buddhist tradition starts in a way with ethical action. So it says, stop harming, stop taking, start giving, start responding with kindness, look for a sense of contentment. If you're acting out of that quality of mind, your experience changes. So for a person who's free from remorse, person who's acting ethically, there's no need for an act of will. May joy arise in me. It's in the nature of things, which is the title of this talk, actually. And this is the link with Buddha nature. It's in the nature of things that joy arises in a person free from remorse. If we act ethically, it's in the nature of things that it feels better, that actually joy starts to arise. In the text, it's piti. Then it goes on, for a joyful person, there's no need for an act of will. May happiness arise. For a person, it's in the nature of things that happiness arises in a person in whom joy has arisen. So this idea that what you're starting to do in Buddhist practice, now I've got to be careful not to talk just about meditation practice, but if you're talking about ethical practice, if you're talking about the whole framework of spiritual friendship, just enough of an interest in another person to think, how do I respond in a way that's helpful? Or meditation practice or study where you're taking on board a picture of the world that's more accurate than the one we habitually work with. All of those are supports for this deepening experience. But what's been said is that this process starts to unfold that's in the nature of things. So I want just to sort of wind towards the end by looking at some of those steps. That there's a lot of different formulations of the Dharma that have this shape, that this sense of a description of this unfolding process. And I want just to stick to one that comes out of mindfulness of breathing, because again, for me, it's so accessible. Your breath is immediately available. And what the tradition's saying is, if you start to pay attention to your breath, you set in motion a process that's in the nature of things. So you pay attention to your breath. And I suppose the first thing is almost the Anapanasati Sutta, the main text on mindfulness of breathing. It says, bring mindfulness to the fore and then breathe in and breathe out. So mindfulness to the fore, you're doing two things. You're realizing that a lot of the time we just don't pay attention. So the first thing that you're doing is you're paying attention, what's happening. So just look at your experience, what's happening. And it's not a cold attention. Sangharakshita talks about it as you're bringing aware positivity to the whole spectrum of your experience. So you're not just as a cool, detached observer noticing the breath. It's like you're feeling it. What's it like to breathe? What's it like when the breath re-energizes your blood? What's it like when there's vitality through your body? What does that feel like? So just taking awareness into that sort of connection to experience. And every in-breath is a moment of connection. And every out-breath is just recognizing you can't hold it. If you try and hold just the in-breath, you gradually suffocate. So there's a natural connecting and there's a natural letting go. And you can relax into the letting go because there's the next in-breath. So there's the next arising. So the first thing you're doing is awareness, connection, empathy, arising, letting go. That's the start of the whole practice. Out of that, it says, follow the breath into the body. And again, you're plugging in to something, the Buddha touching the earth. And you've got this moment of connection. You're doing nothing abstract. It's nothing spacey. It's grounded, it's rooted, it's embodied, it's lived. So you're breathing into the body. And again, you're just connecting with the life in your own embodied being. William Blake talks about the body as that part of the soul experienced by the five senses. So it's just an intrinsic part of that process of awakening. What the sutta says is that if you're aware of the body, your body tends to release. Just the awareness creates a bit of space. And usually we're in this cramped, narrow bit of awareness. You start to pay attention, you open up a space that allows experience to be experienced, allows it to be felt. And what the sutta says is when you do that, the body starts to relax a bit. Again, I hope there's some people for whom this is recognizable. Even if you do it now, just breathe into your body. Just feel what your body's like. And if it's tight, just what would it be like just to let it soften and let it relax a little bit. And it's that accessible. There's half the people in the room going, I can't feel anything. What are you asking me to do? But in theory, you're looking at something really simple. You're opening up a space of awareness. You're connecting, and your experience starts to just naturally release into that space. So the next thing the sutta says, the next thing the teaching says is, what does that feel like? So you're just noticing, what's it like to be more connected to yourself? What's it like to be a little more relaxed? And it's suggesting that often it's pleasurable. And a bit paradoxically, this is a slightly dramatic example, but I went on a solitary retreat immediately after my father's death. And I was doing a lot of meditation practice, and I was sitting and just feeling the grief of somebody that close dying, and the loss of that. And paradoxically, the meditation, in a sense, it wasn't making the grief any less, but what it felt like was to be available to that grief and to feel the love behind that grief was a process of becoming more deeply whole. And there was something really deeply satisfying about rather than push away something painful, to come into relationship to it from something a bit softer and a bit kinder. So paradoxically, that opening up to experience, even painful experience, has this sense of well-being about it, a sense that you're doing something in line with what's quite deeply important to you. So out of the release into that space comes this inflow of energy. You're just more connected to yourself. Out of that comes what the text calls happiness. And happiness just means out of that wholeness, it's a different kind of relationship to ourselves and to the world around us. Like if you feel whole, there's not the same compulsion to find something around us that fills the hole, fills the space. You're okay, but you're interested. So you come into relationship and into connection, but from something a bit more independent, a bit more individual almost. So that there's this sense of what's called sukha, which I would read as this sense of being more deeply in touch with yourself, deeper sense of wholeness, and out of that wholeness, the craving's not so compulsive, the aversion's not so urgent. You're just able to be a bit more wide open and a bit more connected, and something starts to shift at that point. The kleshas stop being the strongest current in our experience. And out of that piti, out of that sukha, out of that kind of emotional opening up, we become a little more aware of those habits of the mind. You don't have to hold on, you don't have to push away. So just this capacity to be with something, to keep interested in it, to be connected to it, and to allow that to be felt, to impact us. You get, first of all, what the sutta talks about is concentration. You're concentrated because you're interested, because you're whole, because you're touching an experience that's quite naturally satisfying. So you're not having to make your mind stay on the breath. You've got a mind that's quite naturally open and curious in its relationship to experience as one of concentration. Out of that concentration comes the mind liberated. Again, I'm just following the different steps of the sutta. And to go back to the Cetana Sutta, it's not an act of will. You're not trying to make the craving go away. You're not trying to make the aversion go away. Just out of that deeper connection to yourself, it's of the nature of things that openness starts to arise. And out of that openness to ourselves, out of that openness to others, to the world around us. I live in a retreat centre, and you see people come out of the meditation room every morning, and we've got a very beautiful garden, but it's like watching people inexplicably transfixed by the wisteria, just standing there and going, wow. And again, I don't want to sort of devalue it, but there's something about what you do in the meditation that just opens up a kind of clarity that allows experience to impact on you. The whole thing starts to become richer, deeper, more textured, so the whole range of our experience. And in that openness to our own flow of experience, you're open without fixing it. You're open without pushing it away. In that openness to ourselves and that openness to others, it moves into what the tradition talks about as seeing things as they really are. And seeing things as they really are, if you go through the traditional Pali versions of it, to be honest, you'd have to be a bit imaginative to think that you like the sound of it. So in the Anapanasati Sutta, it says you're looking at impermanence of all phenomena. And then looking at impermanence, you're looking at fading away. Looking at fading away, you're looking at cessation, and looking at cessation, you're looking at relinquishment. And as philosophical statements, to me, they're less than compelling. And actually what you've got to realise is they're not philosophical statements, they're practice instructions. They're just asking you to look at your experience, look at where you fix it, and to say, what would it be like if you just relaxed around that a bit? Just give it some space, just let it be what it is. Let the breath come, let the breath go, let the feeling come, let the feeling go. So the practice instructions. But at that point, I think it's maybe better just to go back to the images. So where that sequence, that this very careful sequence of what you can pay attention to. And if you pay attention to it, it tends to create space for it. And if you create space for it, it tends to be stronger. And if it's stronger, it becomes a more influential current in your experience. One of the points that, again, gets made in the Buddhist tradition, we talk about nirvana, and you can't help but think about nirvana as a thing, or nirvana as a state. But nirvana is a synonym for enlightenment. But actually what's being said is there aren't any things in Buddhism. It's just another kind of a process. And it's almost like that nirvana is a tendency within experience. And as soon as the tendency is a tendency towards awareness, you've moved from the hordes of demons throwing rocks and boulders at us into a quality of attention that starts to change what experience feels like. You've set in motion a process that gradually deepens and matures away from aversion, away from craving, into openness, into connection. Basic instruction is whatever arises in experience, you pay attention to and you care about it, you respond to it with kindness. Almost, at risk of being a bit reductive, that's what practice is trying to do. But those endpoints, you're probably better going back to the images. And what that process of awareness and experience leads to is like past the bees, you get to the honey. Past the husk, you get to the kernel that nourishes you. Past the inattention, you find something that if you plant it will grow. And it's coming across something that as the awareness, as the kindness starts to unwrap the dirty rags and brushes off the dirt and starts to polish what's inside, what you find is in the depths of our own experience, as we start to pay attention, turns out it was a wee gold Buddha that we're seeing for the first time. And the images, I think, give you the feel for what that process is trying to move us towards. So 2,450 years ago, somebody seeing for the first time and trying to describe it in a way that makes sense to me, to make sense to you, and gives you some kind of access to that experience. That's what we're marking today.